So what we're going to talk about tonight, and what you'll see if you go to that website, is that what we know clearly about anxiety is that it affects three things. It affects thoughts, it affects physical, like your sensations, and it affects your behavior. And that all three things are connected together. So we call that the anxiety triad or anxiety triangle. And there are tools that you can identify for your child or your adolescent that tackles the impact of anxiety on each of those three parts of that triad. So if we look first at I think I do physical first, they get them to tell you, because sometimes little kids don't know that's anxiety. So they think I'm going to throw up, or they think I'm going to faint, or they think I'm having a heart attack. They don't know that it's not physically real. That yes, it's physically real, but it's not an illness that's causing it, to be clear. So you might ask them to list the things that they experience, and you can give them examples about what you experience when you're feeling anxious. So it's things like I've listed there, with the dizziness and the sweating and the shaking and the heart pounding, all of those things. Important to reassure anxious people that you're not going to die in a panic attack, because oftentimes what will happen is, for someone who's had a panic attack, they're very unpleasant things. And then people can become avoidant of doing things in order to avoid a panic attack. So it becomes another level. I can't go to the grocery store because I might have a panic attack. So important to reassure your child that you're not going to have a heart attack because your heart is beating that quickly. You're young and you're healthy and you'll be okay. And to reassure yourself as well, because it can look scary. Then if we think about the thought part of it, one of the things we know for really almost all feelings that you can think of, there's a running dialogue of thoughts going on in our heads, and we refer to them as automatic thoughts, because oftentimes none of us can readily, immediately identify them. So we know that for anxiety, there are certain kinds of thoughts that people tend to have, and they're automatically running in their head. And the other thing we know is that it makes the anxiety worse. So you start getting the kids will tell you that they're thinking, oh, the last time I went to school, I tripped in the hallway, and the kids in the hallway all laughed at me, and they all think I'm stupid, and they're going to laugh at me all the time. I can't go back to school. Or I asked a dumb question in class last week and everybody laughed at me. I'm stupid, and everybody's going to laugh at me all the time. I'll go to school and I'm sure I'm going to throw up. And if I throw up, then everybody will make a big fuss about it and I'll stand out and feel stupid. So what you hear from anxious automatic thoughts is catastrophizing, right? And generalizing. So if one bad thing happens, it's always going to happen. If I, was chosen last for the team or the game at school in gym class, I'll always be chosen last. If I was chosen last, it means I'm not good at anything and people don't like me. It's that automatic catastrophizing and generalizing from one negative to everything. And you can only imagine, of course, that makes the anxiety worse. So you probably won't be able to see this well, but it's a perfect anxious thought cartoon. Because what it is a pilot and a co-pilot in a plane, and you can see the poor beady eyes of the terrified passengers. And one of the pilots is saying, "The fuel light's on, Frank. We're all going to die. We're going to die." And then there's a pause and it's, wait, oh, my mistake, it's the intercom light. So he's broadcast to the plane that they're the passengers. So what you see is it's that catastrophizing. It contaminates and the judgment's gone. And then your anxiety is flooded and you're not thinking properly. So we've done the physical part of that triad and the thoughts. So then we move on to the behavior part. So what you need to do is to help your child to think about, okay, when you're anxious, what are your behaviors? How would you know you're anxious? How does it determine your behavior? How do those all connect? And part of the challenge is helping kids to understand that there is a connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Because sometimes we don't get it either, right? So I don't know about you, but I can have a day where I'll get into work, for example, and there's been like a whole bunch of stuff, like the usual stuff that builds up over the course of, maybe your kids were, out late. I've got a 20-year-old son who thinks it would be grand to come in at 3 a.m. with his middle-aged mother who can't sleep anyway. So, you didn't get enough sleep, you're already kind of tense. it's a terrible drive-in and you're anticipating that it's just going to be one heck of a day, right? So it's that sense that, what am I telling myself about my day? My focus is on what's going to make me anxious, and I'm making it seem like it's going to continue to be lousy. But when I do that, I feel more anxious, and what's my response going to be, right? We need to help our kids to see that, because they can change any part of that triad to make themselves do better and feel better. So in the behavior part of it, it's helping them to talk about, when I'm anxious, what do I do? Well, the main theme for anxious people is avoidance, really. So I don't put my hand up in class. I don't want to go to school at all. I say I'm sick so I can avoid gym class. You know, I don't want to try that test tomorrow because I probably will fail, so I'm going to be sick and I won't go. Or you'll make me go, but I'll go to the office. You barely get out of the driveway before they're calling you because I'm sick. So it's avoidance, and that's the commonest thing we see with anxiety. So the unfortunate part with avoidance, amongst its many horrible qualities, is that it gets really habit forming. So for example, think about if you're nervous of the dentist, for example, or you're going to have a colonoscopy, some hideous thing that all of us are probably anxious about. And the day before, and you've been kind of building yourself up for this thing that you're nervous about, getting more and more nervous, they call and they cancel. Well, you get that tremendous relief. It's like, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to do it. And then you're motivated to hope that that continues to be the case, that you can continue to avoid it, right? So what we see with anxious people is exactly that. So the anxious child wants to avoid the thing that makes them anxious. We all hope it isn't school, because then you end up with school-phobic responses, right? So I don't want to go to school, I don't want to go to school, and if I avoid school today, I convince you that I'm sick, and I get to stay home, then I'm going to want to do it even more tomorrow, because it got rid of that unpleasant emotion so quickly. One of the things that we find as for parents is that it's really important, though, to teach kids about the anxiety process, so they can understand that that avoidance and escaping the anxiety this time means the next time you're challenged in that situation, your anxiety is going to be higher, and you're just making the anxiety last longer, because we do know that's a physiological response as well. So I always use the example of, for me, I'm horribly flight phobic. So, and when I say horribly flight phobic, you people don't know me, but it's not pretty traveling with me. My husband always says that if he can manage to get to wherever we're going without wanting to divorce me, he's done really well. And I can see myself doing it. In the airport, fussing over luggage tags, being neurotic about everything, yelling at him, because anxious people are irritable people, right? So if I have a year where I have to fly a lot, where I find myself on one of those horrible little puddle jumper planes to Toronto a lot, I find I'm not as anxious. The first 2 or 3 times I'm anxious, but if I fly again within 2 weeks, it's not as bad, and then it's not as bad, and then it's not as bad. But the last time I flew, I hadn't flown in about 5 years, and I was flying overseas. And really, it's a wonder people didn't just put me like in a body bag and carry me on the plane, because there'd been all this period of time of avoidance. I could have flown in those times. I was just doing a really good job of, we could drive to Florida, won't the experience be wonderful? Oh, we're in a snowstorm. That's unfortunate, but I'd rather be in a snowstorm than in the air. So it's important, one of the real experts, and I reference her, talks about the worry hill. It's a woman named Doreen Wagner, and it's really a nice image. I don't know if you guys have heard of her. It's a good image for kids to understand their anxiety and this whole notion of don't avoid or it gets worse. Because she talks about it's like you're climbing up a hill. At the top of the hill is the thing that's making you anxious. So that's writing the test, going to the birthday party, doing the sleepover, going to school. And as you get closer and closer to that fateful event, you start going up the hill, and your anxiety is going up and going up and going up and going up. The urge as an anxious person is to get the heck out of there. If mom or dad say, you don't have to go to that birthday party, dear, it's not the biggest deal in the world. You don't have to go back to that soccer team if they were mean to you on that one time. We'll avoid. So you're partway up that hill and you avoid. Well, yes, your anxiety on that occasion goes whoop, back down again. But the next time you're confronted with that anxiety trigger, The hill, you move quicker up that hill, and it's a steeper hill. So it's just a physiological reaction. If kids can understand the opposite, which is you challenge yourself to a fear and you sit in that fear, don't run away. Until that parasympathetic nervous system response, you're obviously not going to use that word, kicks in, and naturally your body stops being so anxious. So I was hunky-dory on my flight once I got on the plane and it was in the air, because you can't stay that anxious. I mean, I don't think I could have stayed that anxious if I was waiting for the executioner. So it's trying to get people to understand, and kids to understand, there's a reason why mom and dad are working with you to break this fear down into its steps and challenge you not to avoid. We're not just being mean. So, one of the things you'll hear from anxious kids and adolescents is they seek reassurance. Is it going to be okay? It's going to be okay. Are you going to be here to get me? You're coming home. When are you coming home? Where are you going to be? Could we have the door to my bedroom open? I still can't hear you. Where are you? You can't go do the laundry on the basement because I need you on this floor. All those things, it's all reassurance seeking because they're trying to reduce the anxiety. What we see in class with anxious kids are things like, I've got a stomach ache, I've got to go home, I've got a headache, I need to go to the office, sitting silently and not participating, or getting overwhelmed and getting really irritable, like me in the airport. So, your nerves are like on edge when you're anxious. It's like fingernails on a blackboard. So one more thing, one more demand, or you interpret it as a demand, and then the kid can melt down. What we want to say is, it's important not to label kids as being difficult or stubborn when some of the behavior could very much be related to anxiety. So it's just important to ask yourself about anxiety when you see things with your kids. So are they avoiding because they're anxious, or are they avoiding because they just don't feel like it? It's just important to look for a pattern and ask yourself that question. So, how and what to teach your child or your teenager about anxiety? Once again, beating that message, anxiety is normal. It isn't dangerous. You're not going to die from it. Sometimes it's helpful. And you need to have a really positive, as the caregiver, optimistic attitude. And sometimes that's hard as a parent, I know. I'm sure you've all found, I know I have, found myself in situations where you're reassuring by talking about you're bigger than this problem, right? Because what can happen with kids is they can say, I'm anxious, I can't do it, right? So it's like the anxiety becomes who they are. So it would be like if you had a child who tended to have low frustration tolerance and blow up, right? You don't want your child that's like that to begin to believe that they're a mad person, they're an angry person, I'm a bad boy. I have a bad, temper. You're trying to separate that out and remind the child that they have lots of strengths and lots of skills, because that's empowering. Similarly with anxiety, you're not your anxiety. You are bigger than your anxiety. So that's an important message to give, and you give it by not saying, oh, don't be silly, don't be scared. Why are you scared of that? That's silly. You're a big kid. You shouldn't be scared of that. If you hear yourself saying shouldn't be and don't be, remind yourself that if it was as simple as that for any of us as people with our things that we have that don't work so well for us, we would all fix it, right? So I come from a generation where, the parent approach was, get over yourself, or I'll give you something to be worried about, right? Because the message was, just stop it, right? But there's no skill involved in just stop it, because no one likes being anxious, and we would have stopped it if we could. So you're giving a message of, I know what this is like, I've been anxious too. If you're an anxious person, you can say, I really know what this is like, and here's some of the things we can do to manage it so it doesn't get in your way. So that's back to this whole thing of talking about the worry hill, so that you're not just the big bad parent forcing them to do things they don't want to do. You're giving them the context for understanding why it's important that you not let them escape. If you're planning, if you have a child that has a fear of doing sleepovers, for example, and they're getting to an age where that's getting more and more obvious to their peers, and they're getting some questions from peers about how come you don't. So they're sort of feeling like, on one hand, they'd like to do it. Then instead of just continuing to give them the message, well, don't worry about it, you just won't do it, you're going to work with them to figure out how they can tackle that anxiety-provoking situation and learn some skills so they can do those normal activities. All right, so one of the things that's fun to do when you're helping kids to identify what their anxiety does to them, particularly for little kids, but adolescents like to do it too, and they'll sometimes do it with like collage kind of stuff. But for little kids, what we do is get a big piece of paper and have them trace their body, and then get them to mark on that tracing of themselves in colors, whatever they want to do. Where do they feel their anxiety? So butterflies in their stomach. I've had kids, do that, butterflies in my stomach. They'll make ziggly lines for how rigid they get in their muscles. You're doing that because it's all about separating the anxiety from them. I can't emphasize that enough, because for kids, really for all of us, but for kids, if they can get a sense that it's just a thing that happens to me and I can get it in charge of it, it makes all the difference in the world. So you can name the anxiety. I didn't have anxiety in my son, but I certainly had, he was the kid that people could set off at school because he had a temper. He named his temper. And a lot of what we did was around what were the tools and who was on his side to deal with that temper. And similarly, that's what you do for anxiety. So little kids will, name it silly names. It's important if you're doing that, don't let them name it a big, huge name. So it can't be it can't be the Hulk, it can't be, that was for the temper. It was my son's initial response. It was not a good plan to name the temper guy the Hulk, because we were going to have a hard time fighting him. So similarly, make sure if anxiety has a name, it has a little dinky name that you can squash, right, that you can beat. Then the next challenge is, how do you help them to face the things that make them anxious? One of the things that's good to do, once you've talked a lot about, your thoughts what are your anxious thoughts and what do they do to your feelings, and then how do you tend to react when you're anxious, is to talk to them about how would you give advice to a friend? Because kids can give we all can give super duper advice to other people than ourselves, but so can kids. So if you said to your child, what would you do if your friend was really, really afraid of the water, and it meant that they couldn't do any of the fun things that people do together as kids around the water. They can't go to birthday parties because they're afraid to be near a pool. They won't go to the beach because they don't even want to be in the sand because they're afraid of the water. What would you do? Would you tell your friend just to forget about any of those fun activities? Not so much. They wouldn't say that, right? What would you do? Well, they usually would say some version of practice being around water. It's what they say. And they'll do it in funny ways. So I've done this with little kids, and they'll say, have them splash water on themselves, have them squirt water on themselves. All of it is fine, because they're giving you exactly what us wise psychologists do, which is practice in small steps moving up towards the big feared thing. So one of the things we used to do when I was in training originally is people thought we knew we had that reaction, right, that I've described, that fear hill. So we knew there was that sympathetic nervous system reaction, and wahoo, away goes the adrenaline. And we knew that after a period of time, along comes that parasympathetic response, and it'll calm down. So we thought, well, why don't we just implode people? So if you're afraid of snakes, I'm going to wrap one right around your neck. And I'm not going to let you take that snake off your neck, because eventually you won't be anxious anymore. Well, we sort of learned that that's not the best thing in the world, right? So putting on fear factor isn't the way of approaching it. What we did learn was that it's important to think of what the goal thing, what's the big scary thing, and then think of what are the approximations of it, right? So if you were really afraid of doing, having your mom and dad leave your room before you go to sleep at night. And, certainly there's lots of little kids that are 8, 9, and 10 years old, and that they can't. Their mom and dad have to lie with them until they go to sleep. And they get awfully good at feeling a lifting of the mattress so that no one ever gets a decent night's sleep. So what you do is, the goal is to get to the point where you can make it through the night on your own. And you have to do some work, because anxious kids will say, well, it doesn't bother me. Doesn't bother me, doesn't bother me. I'll sleep with you until I'm 50. It's not a problem. So you have to try and amplify the reasons why, what's getting in the way about that. And then with their help, let them have some control, break it down into steps. Reward every step accomplished, for sure, with a huge big reward at the end, and expect there to be regression. So even if you get to the top and you've had 2 weeks of that child sleeping on their own through the night, maybe you've had to get a special night light and they get a reward every morning, but they're doing it, something else can happen in an anxious person's life that makes them regress. Don't scream and yell and want to die, or at least do it privately. Start over. You probably won't have to do this as many small steps. It'll move more quickly, because we know that about anxiety as well. So that's what I'm going to go on to talk to you about. So set a clear goal, have the child help you to set it. Start out, the experts usually recommend that you start out, the first step on that process has to be something that the person has been successful at. So you don't start out with something that they can't really do, because it's going to take forever and they're going to only meet defeat and it won't work. So you want to start out making it be a simple step. So if, for example, it's the child that won't sleep without you being in the bed with them, why don't you start out by saying, I am going to sit on your bed, and I will not leave until you're asleep, but I am not going to lie down, I'm going to sit. My feet are up on the bed, my back's against the headboard, I'm here for the duration, but I'm not lying down. You got to think of something that changes it up a little bit, challenges the anxiety a little bit, but doesn't flood the child. The other thing you have to be working on, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is they have to have some tools in their toolkit. If you're expecting, like even my pitiful flight phobia, I do try and have some coping techniques that I use. My family probably says they don't work that well, but I try, and I try it for it not to be just drinking excessively on the plane as an approach. So, I've said reward. You have got to reward, and don't look upon it as being bribery, even if people around you are saying it is. Because if you think about it, you're asking your child to challenge themselves to face something that's really awful. Like, it's very painful to experience that anxiety. So they need to get a reward for having tackled it. Because remember, the pull for us anxious people is to say, I'm perfectly fine all by myself in this room. I'm going to avoid as my safest fallback. So I need a lot of rewards as an anxious child to tackle those things. So get them involved in that. And I'm not talking about, buying Xbox games or something. I'm talking about having small step rewards, and maybe at the end of it, a bigger reward. And oftentimes it's important for them to be social rewards, so you're not just buying things, you're doing things together. My fear thermometer. Adolescents use a fear thermometer as well. This one is a picture of one from one of those websites, and you can print them up. And you're teaching your child to rate how afraid they are. So for adults, we do it for adults, we do it for adolescents. You don't usually tend to have those little cute faces, but you have numbers, and they use numbers on that thermometer to anchor how anxious they are. There's two main reasons why that's important. One, the very act of rating your fear puts you in charge of your fear. So if you think about it, you've had to sort of step back, use your judgment, compare this level of fear to other levels of fear you've had, and come up with a rating. So it reminds you that you're in charge on some level. The other thing it does is it allows you to be in charge of your movement on the ladder towards that goal. And literally, we do talk about it as being like a ladder. It's like a fear ladder. For adults going into therapy, if you went into therapy and you were afraid of, public speaking or something, we would talk about it as systematic desensitization. But what it is you got the goal that's up at the top of this ladder, and you're making each step of the ladder be a part of the movement towards that goal. And when you're practicing with your child, when they're practicing that step on that ladder that you've written down and you've agreed on together, then basically they're going to tell you how afraid were they. They're going to say, this is where my anxiety was. And they don't move off that step on the ladder until their anxiety goes down below 3. So if you're going up where 10 is that wild-looking face with the tongue sticking out, and down below 1 is the happy, smiley, sunny-looking face, you don't want them to be beyond the 3 on that fear thermometer before you move to the next step up. And it requires enormous patience. But having done it, both in my professional life and in my personal life, I can tell you it sure as the heck is worthwhile. So this is patience that pays off. The other way in which it pays off is that ultimately you've taught a skill that the person can continue to use.